Good morning. How we doing? Everybody enjoying your summer? 3 of you. Awesome. It's summer in Ohio, right? It should be a wonderful time, and I hope you really are enjoying your summer, and the truth is that's why we titled this series, The Good News of Summer. Now, we're diving into the book of Philippians. Paul, throughout this book, talks about good news. In fact, he mentions it 10 different times, but we all like good news, right? I mean, who doesn't? Everybody loves good news, especially during the summer. This past week, my kids, a long week, and I said, hey, this Friday, we're gonna go out on the boat and we're going to have fun all day. And they're all excited and they're inviting friends. And why? That's good news, right? We want to have good news. Well, what's interesting is if someone asks you, and this happens a lot, hey, I've got some good news and some bad news. Which do you want first? What do you want? Everybody wants the bad news, right? Well, some of you said good, but most people want the bad news first. Why? You want to get the bad news over with because good news always gives you hope. You don't want to start with the good news because you start with the good news, then the bad news follows. It's kind of like the pilot that got on the intercom in the airplane and he said, ladies and gentlemen, I got some good news and some bad news. The good news is you're going to be on the news tonight. Some of you will get that later. It's good. But the truth is, when you do the good news first, it gives you no hope, right? Well, Paul writes this letter to a church, a group of believers in Philippi, and he's wanting to give them good news. Now, Paul is suffering some bad news, right? And he's dealing with a lot of stuff. And in life, we have these same scenarios. There's good news and bad news. Now, what's interesting about good news is good news doesn't last for a very long time. Let me give you a couple of examples that might pertain to your life when it comes to good news. How many of you remember the very first time you got approved for your first mortgage for your house? Yeah, it's good news, right? All right, we're going to be homeowners. This is going to be exciting. When you got news that you were going to have your first child, right? Great news, fantastic. When you close the deal with that very first client at your job, great news. When your kid comes thundering through the door with their report card and they're like, Mom, I got a B in chemistry. And you thought for sure they were going to get a D, right? It's good news. And good news is something that we all look forward to. But have you ever noticed that good news has expiration dates? You ever notice that? You know that child that you were all excited about? Now they're keeping you up all hours of the night. It's not such great news, is it? That mortgage that you were so excited about because you got your first home, then you get the first statement and you realize that they're going to come every month for the next 30 years. Okay, that job that you got so excited about, well, now you got to show up to work every day. That client that you hire or that you got and you were so excited about, now you got to keep them happy. See, what happens with good news is there's an expiration date. And here's how most of us are wired. After we get that good news, what do we go looking for? We go bad news. No. Maybe, I don't know. You go looking for more good news. That's how we're wired. We're always looking for good news. But here's the thing, we're looking for good news in the wrong way. And here's why I love this letter in Philippians is Paul is writing a letter. Again, he's in probably some of the toughest circumstances that you could possibly think of. But he's talking about something that is far greater. It doesn't last a week. It doesn't last a month. It doesn't last a year. It doesn't last 30 years. It lasts for all of eternity. And he's trying to let people know, even in the worst of situations, there's something better that we need to be looking for in life. Now, Paul wrote 3/4 of the New Testament. Most of the books of the Bible are in the New Testament, are letters that Paul wrote to different people or churches. And what's interesting is this is Paul's probably toughest circumstance, but it's probably his most joy-filled letter, arguably. Most scholars would argue that it's probably the most joy-filled book in all of the Bible, all 66 books. This is the one. Yet Paul is on trial. He's getting ready to go on trial. He's in chains in a prison, and he's facing execution. Now, it's nothing like modern-day prisons, okay? There were no televisions. There were no, hey, you get to go outside and have an hour of exercise and some sunshine to get some vitamin D. There was no commissary where friends and loved ones could send money, and you put on a card, and you can go and you can buy, ho-ho cakes and oatmeal cream pies. None of that. Okay, he's chained to a Roman guard in a dingy dungeon, and yet Paul is facing death. Yet Paul has some of the most joy-filled words to this group of believers at Philippi, and you wonder why. We're gonna take off where we left off last week in Philippians chapter 1, verse 20. For I fully expect and hope that I will never be ashamed, but that I will continue to be bold for Christ as I have been in the past. And I trust that my life will bring honor to Christ. Ready for this? Whether I live or whether I die. Now let's just get this over with right now. How many of you, by a show of hands, are excited to die? Isn't that interesting? Very few people, okay? And you think the people that are excited or okay with death, that maybe they're just a little off, right? But the truth is they're not. And Paul is one of these. Paul is saying, look, there's a lot going on, and whether I'm alive or whether I die, I'm good with what's going on. I've lived and am fully for and engaged in a relationship with Jesus. Again, he's waiting on this trial, and he doesn't know what's going to take place and how it's going to all work out. And you wonder sometimes when you read books like this, you wonder, why is it? Why is it that Paul is different, okay? Why is it that he's so bold? And sometimes we come into these situations and we maybe misconstrue the writer of the letter, in this case, Paul. We think, okay, he's just one of these, he's Tony Robbins, half glass full, everything's going to be awesome and work out, right? You ever around those people where everything's always awesome? You just want to smack the smile off their face because they never have a bad day, right? And Paul's not that, okay? That's not what's going on here. So we want to make sure that we understand it. Paul actually experienced and received good news firsthand. Let's go back and kind of reflect on Paul's life. Paul at one time had a different name. His name was Saul. He was a religious leader. He was a Pharisee, which means he was like a Jew of all Jews. He was all about the rules and regulations. He wasn't about a relationship. He was about religion. He was making sure that he checked all the boxes and he did good, so one day he could go before God and show his resume. Hey, God, this is what I did. Look how awesome I am. And then Jesus. Paul did not like Christians. He did not like believers in Jesus because they weren't about the rules and regulations of Judaism. They were about a relationship. So he and a bunch of other Pharisees got together and they started knocking out Christians. They were killing them. Okay, they were persecuting them. And Paul's on his way to persecute some Christians. He's on this road called the road to Emmaus, and he has an encounter with Jesus. And Jesus, now mind you, Jesus is not on this earth, okay? He's already lived. He's already died for the sins of mankind. He's ascended into heaven, and he encounters Saul with a bright light, and he says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? What's the deal here, buddy? And then he blinds Saul. Now, what's interesting is Jesus then has an encounter with another man named Ananias. Now, Ananias is a believer in Jesus, a follower of Jesus, a good, godly man. And Jesus says, hey, Ananias, I want you to go to Saul, to where Saul is at. I'm going to tell you where he's at, and I want you to heal him and then tell him about me. And Ananias is like, you want me to do what? This guy kills people. He kills us. He kills Christians. I'm not ready. Hang on. I'm not ready to die yet, right? But Ananias moves forward. He goes, he has this conversation with Saul. Saul's name changes to Paul. And what's interesting, in Acts chapter 9, verse 15, Acts chapter 9, verse 15, these words are written. But the Lord said, go, for Saul is my what? Chosen instrument to take my message to the Gentiles and to kings as well as the people of Israel. I want to stop there and I want to ask a question because I think it's important. What if Ananias wouldn't have done that? What if he wouldn't have been faithful to what Jesus had called him to do? We would never have this letter written by Paul. It's interesting that sometimes Jesus is writing a different story than we're writing. Talked about that a couple of weeks ago. And the question is, are we open to the story that he's writing and how he wants to use us? Because, see, Paul was a chosen instrument. Interestingly enough, we're all chosen instruments, right? We're God's plan A. I don't really know why. I question that a lot. Why in the world would God use broken, messed up people like you and I? But see, that's what God does. And see, Paul's identity became an identity found in Jesus, not in all of the rules and regulations. Our identity is not found in our mess ups and our mistakes or what we grew up believing. Our identity is in the person of Jesus Christ. And if there's anything that we can take away this morning, it's simply this: who you are at your core determines who you live for every day. Who you are at your core determines who you live for every day. Let me ask you just an honest question. When you get up in the morning and you look in the mirror, what do you see? See, a lot of times we see the person that we aren't, don't we? We begin to look at the things that aren't perfect about us and we want to fix them. Oh man, I wish I was a little skinnier. I wish I was a little more muscular. If you have straight hair, you want curly hair. If you got curly hair, you want straight hair. If you have long hair, you want short hair. If you got crooked teeth, you want straight teeth. If you got straight teeth, you want white teeth. Whatever. It just goes and goes and goes, right? And we begin to kind of compare, look, this is who I am. And when you look in the mirror, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Now, once you get past the, hey, I wish I looked like Lou Ferrigno or Arnold Schwarzenegger, I wish that every day. It's never going to happen. But when you get past that, then you begin to look at who you really are. Have you ever taken just a deep look at yourself in the mirror and really thought about who you are? For some of you, you're your parents' child. It's just a fact of life. That's who you are. You are spending your life trying to appease your parents. You want them to think well of you. You want them to be proud of you. Even as an adult, there's something internal in you. For some of you, it's not that at all. For some of you, it's the profession that you have. You look in the mirror and you see that you are a successful person. You got the right letters at the end of your name. You got the right position. You make the right amount of money. You got all those things, and that's who you see yourself as, and you think you're successful. Some of you see yourself. It's not that. You see yourself as a mom or a dad, and you want to be the best mom or dad. But the truth is, you've got that troubled kid. You got that kid that's making decisions that you didn't teach them to make, and you're wondering why, and you feel like a failure as a parent. Or you ever do this as a parent? You get with a bunch of other parents and you look at their kids and you think their life is all together and yours is a mess, and now you're embarrassed to be with them because you can't keep up with them. I mean, just be honest. What do you see in the mirror? See, if we aren't careful, we'll allow society, we'll allow our family, we'll allow our careers to begin to dictate who we are at our absolute core, and it's not what God called us to be or to live. It's not. So when you get off track, here's what happens. This word shame begins to creep in. And then you begin to live that shame. You begin to not realize who you are at your core, and you allow the things, maybe some mistakes, even mistakes other people have made or other things that have happened, to become your identity. And in Philippians 1, Paul beautifully reminds us that our identity is not found in those things. It's not found in our successes and our failures. It's not found in who we are as a parent or what we do as a career. It's found in who we are in Jesus Christ. That we're anchored in who God says we are. And that's ultimately what we're trying to live for each and every day. That you are a loved child of God and you were created in His image. That you are a loved child of God and you are created in His image. I'll say it one more time. That you are a loved child of God and you are created in His image. That He willingly allowed His perfect Son to go to a cross and die and pay the sin debt for your mess ups and your mistakes so you could be in a relationship with Him. That one day you're going to leave this earth and you're going to end up somewhere for eternity, and it's two choices. You're going to be with God for all of eternity, or you're not. You do realize that's hell. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just trying to be real with you. You know what hell is? It's the absence of God. Can you imagine life without Him? So the question is, are you and is your life anchored in this truth that you are a chosen child of God and that He wants something different for your life? And I know some of you right now, you're like, Sean, okay, that's good, but how? How do we do that? Well, interestingly, Paul talks about this in Philippians chapter 1. Let's just keep moving on. In Philippians chapter 1, verses 21 through 24, for to me, living means living for Christ. Here's where things get a little weird. And dying, well, hot dog, that's even better. Now, again, we come into that and we're like, whoa, 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 wait a minute. That's not what we want. Paul's trying to get us to see that there's something better that we could live for, and if we die, we actually get the thing that we're living for that's better. But if I live, I can do more fruitful work for Christ. So I really don't know which is better. So he's, having that, what's better, to live or to die? I'm torn between two desires. Now, do any of you have those desires right now? Are you torn? Most of us are not torn. Most of us are like, yep, I want my feet grounded right here. I'm glad I got up. I'm on this side of the earth. Life is good. But when and how do we get to a place that we're okay with, maybe, just maybe, we're not called to live here? He says, I long to go and be with Christ, which would be far better for me, but for you and your sake, it is better that I continue to live. Why? Because I'm spreading the message of the gospel. However, if I lose my life, I'm good with it. For me to live is Christ, and for me to die is better. It's gain. And that's what Paul's trying to tell us. And it's incredible because Paul's saying many people, what we fear the most and what we spend most of our time trying to avoid, we're trying to avoid death, is actually something that he looks forward to. Now, I want to be clear. Paul is not sick and demented. He's not saying, hey, man, I've got a death wish, and I just hope I leave this earth. That's not at all what he's saying. He's not saying, hey, it would just be better off if I wasn't around. It's not that at all. He's not dealing with some sort of emotional issues deep in his core. What he's saying is, even if this thing doesn't work out, even if it doesn't play out the way that I hope it plays out, even if something happens to me, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to win either way, which is great for the people who are trying to punish Paul. Think about that. Hey, man, if we kill him, he's happy about it. So that's really not a punishment. And if we let him live, he's happy because he gets to spread the message of the gospel, right? And if we make him suffer, he's good for that too, because he says, hey, if I've got to suffer for it, it's good. That means the message of the gospel is continuing forward. I mean, how bonkers is that, right? The Romans don't even know what to do with him. And see, this is what made Christianity so unstoppable, is because people actually believed that they were the messengers of Jesus Christ, and if it cost them their life, then they would move on to something better. No matter what happens, you win. No matter what happens, Christ gets the glory. No matter at the end of the day, we get eternity. Think about that for a second. Do you actually know what it means to live for Jesus? Have you ever really thought about that? See, it's to do the fruitful work of Christ. It's fulfilling Matthew 28, the Great Commission. Do we know what Matthew 28 is? We talk about it all the time. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded. And Jesus says, and I will be with you always to the very end of the age. This is what we're called to do. We're called to go and to make. This is why we celebrate so much when somebody gets immersed. What happened? Everybody stands and cheers, and people yell and scream and clap. Why? Because someone's entered into a covenant relationship with Jesus. It's why we celebrate when people get into community, because it's about doing life with other believers and ironing, sharpening iron, and you growing in your faith and your understanding. It's why we get so excited when you join a serve team, because you're helping move not only the mission of the church, but you're growing in your faith and you're beginning to flesh that out and what that looks like. Because not only has eternity changed, but you've answered the call to be a part of something that's bigger than yourself. See, I say this a lot. We just had a baptism. We're having another baptism at our 11 o'clock service, and we're having a couple of more after our 11 o'clock service. We had a couple last week, and we seem to be having more and more and more of them, and they're exciting, right? It's exciting to see, and it's exciting to be a part of a church that people are coming into this relationship with Jesus, and they're wanting to live for him. But it's just like the wedding that I did last night, and I tell every couple that I do a wedding for, we're standing there, and I said, look, I tell them this in premarital counseling every time I get with them. I said, look, the best day of your life is going to be your wedding. You know why? Because everything's going to be perfect. You're going to be dressed up. You're going to present your best. All your friends and family, there's going to be a wild party. You are going to have a great time. You're going to go on your honeymoon, and then you're going to come home, and guess what? That's when real work happens, right? It takes work. How many of you have been married more than 3 minutes know that marriage is work? It's the same thing with a child. It's all cute and cuddly until it keeps you up all night, right? It's work. And the relationship with Jesus is work. It's not, okay, all of a sudden I've accepted Christ. I've become a follower of him. I've entered into a covenant relationship. I can kick my feet up. Life is good. No, that's just the starting point. But oftentimes the church teaches that that's the end point, that that's the end of the game. No. That's the beginning. The wedding ceremony is the beginning of a marriage. The baptism ceremony is the beginning of a relationship with Jesus. Paul continues in verse 25. He says this, he says, knowing this, I am convinced that I will remain alive so I can continue to help all of you grow and experience the joy of your faith. See, he's convinced deep down that God's going to work this whole thing out. He's got faith that it is. It's back to, if you remember in the book of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, hey, we get it. Our God's going to protect us. Oh, by the way, but if he doesn't, we're still good with this. We're not going to bow. Paul's saying the same thing. It's just in the other half of the Bible. It's in the New Testament and not the Old Testament. Which gets to something I really want us to think about, and that's this. What would it look like for us to actually help people grow and experience the joy of their faith? What would it look like if you actually helped people experience the joy and help them grow in their faith? What would that do to you? What would that do to someone else? See, this may come to a shock to some of you, but God's called all of us to be a part of his deal. He's not just called Sean and Sheldon and Mark and a few other pastors, and you guys just get to show up and chill out and relax and let us do the religious thing, and then you go to work and do your work thing. That's not what God's asked. God said, hey, it's all of us. Look around the room. Look at the number of people that are here. Go ahead, look. Stop looking at me. Look around. It's okay. Look at all the people that are here. You know what you're saying? You're saying, hey, I'm a believer in Jesus. I want to grow in my faith. Part of growing in our faith is sharing it with other people, which gets to a couple of truths that I want to talk about this morning. I'm going to give you 3 of them. The first is this. You have a bigger purpose in life. I will go to my grave believing, teaching, and preaching this. Again, none of us, me included, we don't get to, hey, I've got Christ, I'm good. When I die, I know I get to go to heaven, so I'm just going to go about my life. No. You have a plan and a purpose. God wants to use you. We've been called. It means that you have to get off the sidelines and get in the game. You know what's interesting? When you're a kid, remember kickball? Maybe you were the last person to get picked. Maybe I was just the only last person to get picked. Maybe you got picked first. But anyway, you wanted to get in the game, right? You wanted to play. You ever play Little League Baseball? You know, only the good kids got to play, and you got to pick your nose on the bench, right? You wanted to get in the game. It's interesting, when you're a kid, you want to be in the game, but when you're an adult, you don't. Isn't that interesting? We're in a game that God wants us to be in, and we're like, yeah, no, I'll just pick my nose. It's good. See, the good news is that each of us is learning about who God is, falling more and more in love with him, and then sharing that with other people. It's good news. When good news happens to you, you want to share it. There are other people who need to hear it. There are other people who need to hear the message of grace and forgiveness, and they're not going to darken the door of a church. They're just not. Can I just tell you? God loves using unqualified, ordinary people like you and me. None of us are all that smart, okay? We're really not. We're not that good. But yet he uses us anyway. He uses us in our mess-ups. He uses us in our brokenness. He uses us when we don't get it all right, because none of us do. But he uses us in spite of us. See, I believe this to be wholehearted. It is not, or the best way to grow in your relationship with Jesus is to help others discover their relationship with Jesus. And you do that how? You start where you are. You simply start where you are, okay? You cannot over-focus that. You've got to start where you are. Where are you? What do you do? Right? Think about, where are you right now in life? Young moms, you do coffee dates with other moms? You let the kids play on the playground? You know what I used to call those when my wife did them? Sanity days. Right? You'd let the kids go play on the playground. You didn't care if they smashed their face on something. All you cared about was having coffee and catching up with another adult human. You're like, oh my gosh, who cares that he's eating dirt? Eat dirt. We're going to connect, right? Use those moments, because there are moms that you do life with every day that don't yet know who Jesus is, and you could have coffee, and you could begin to share the gospel with them. Your neighbor, right? I've got a new neighbor. His name's Sheldon. He moved into our neighborhood, and I'm trying to teach him who Jesus is, right? It's my mission field. But seriously, your neighbor, you've got neighbors that don't yet know Jesus. They're great people. You connect with them on a level, you like being around them. My gosh, begin to spend time with them. Begin to open up conversation at a little bit deeper level. It's scary, hear me, it is. But once you do it a couple of times, it becomes second nature. You know what I do? I just look for the things in the person that I like about them, and then I begin to ask spiritual questions around those things. Like if somebody's super generous, I'm like, man, I actually had this conversation with an individual one time. I said, it amazes me, as generous as you are, that you're not a follower of Jesus. That surprises me. Can you help me understand why not? You know what I just did? I just forced them to answer the question. I don't have to answer questions anymore. Now I'm in a position that I can just keep asking questions. So you're not presenting anything, you're just getting to know them. How about your coworker? You work with a person 5 days a week. There are people that you work with, that you do life with, that you connect with. God's done that for a reason. All you have to do is share what Jesus has done in your life and how he's changed you. This is where we I believe, get it wrong. We think we have to have degrees in Bible theology in order to share the gospel. No, you don't. This is who I am because of Jesus, and this is what he's done in my life. It's that simple. I shared this back in one of our other sermon series here a couple of months ago. My life change story. I think this is the best way to do it. 20%, what life was like before Jesus. So about 20% of your story, just, hey, this is who I was before Jesus. We all have a before Jesus story, right? I want to tell you something that's incredibly important because we're kind of enamored with, the dope dealer that did 10 years in prison and came out and found Jesus and all of a sudden he's awesome and you don't think your story matches up. I promise you right now, you are with people and doing life with people that your story will absolutely change their life because it's exactly what God's done. It's the beauty of how he works. You have a story. It doesn't have to be, the DEA kicked in my door and drugged me off and I had $3 million worth of drugs in my basement. It doesn't have to be that. But there is something. This is who I was before Christ. Then 20% how you came to know Jesus. And most importantly, and the part we don't talk a lot about, is 60% is what difference has he made in your life? What is it that he's changed in your life? See, we don't have everything figured out. And the minute you think you have everything figured out, you've just proven you don't have everything figured out. It's not about figuring out life. It's about understanding who the answer is and who to go to when we're trying to figure life out. See, Jesus isn't just a story to be told. It's a truth to be lived. It's a relationship that he wants with us. It's a truth to be lived when we feel like it and we don't. You ever have those moments where you just don't feel like you want to be a Christian? You just think it'd be easier to just go live like the rest of the world? Well, the truth is, Jesus understands that because we're broken and we're fallen. It's a truth to be lived when we're single and when we're within a marriage. It's a truth to be lived when life is great and when life is hard. We've all, I promise you, if we took everybody in this room and we created a circle and we just spent time walking around the circle and you would tell stories of things that have happened to you, right? We all have stories where life threw curveballs, and I bet we could spend hours listening to these stories. And the truth is, they're stories that have marked us and molded us and shaped us, and it's part of what God's got us through to be able to share with other people, which leads to the last truth that I want to talk about is that we don't have to go through trials of life alone. We don't. We don't have to go through this life by ourselves. Paul continues. He says in verse 27, Philippians 1, above all, you must live as citizens of heaven, conducting yourself in a manner worthy of the good news of Christ. Now, if you're following along, jump down to verse 29. He says, for you have been given not only the privilege of trusting Christ. You ready for this? But also the privilege of suffering for him. Yeehaw! Church is over. Let's pray. Who wants to suffer? Anybody? I don't think so. It's not in our nature to want to suffer. Most people do not consider it a privilege to suffer. Yet we need to understand, as followers of Jesus, and this is so true, every circumstance we face in life is an opportunity to point people to Jesus. Every circumstance. I'm going to say it again. Every circumstance is an opportunity to point people to Jesus. Whether good or bad. Whether it's in your control or out of your control, it's an opportunity to point people to Jesus. And I promise you, people watch how you engage. They watch you, how you go through the situation. They watch your posture and your attitude. Paul goes on to say in verse 30, he says, we are all in this struggle together. Can I get an amen on that, right? There are just days, man, it just seems like a struggle. See, the good news does not promise a life without suffering. It does promise that you don't have to suffer alone. You know what Paul had? Paul had a community. Remember, Philippians was a response. It was a letter that was written to a response to a group of believers that were encouraging Paul. I think sometimes we think it's the other way around. Paul wrote that letter back to them, but they were the first to initiate encouragement. Why? Because that's what the church does. The church rises up and meets people in their greatest needs, and they're not afraid to care for one another. And what happens is Paul says, look, there's a response, and the response is, look, we all struggle, we all go through things, but look, we're in this together. There's a community just like that, just like what we're seeing. The community is here. It's in our church, where we walk alongside of each other. We share in each other's suffering. You don't do this thing by yourself. Hear me. John Wesley, I think, said it best. He said, the Bible knows nothing of solitary religion. And I believe that to be true. We are not going to get through this alone. We are made for relationships. We are. We're hardwired for it. Now, some of you are made for more relationships than others, right? You have the extrovert. I married one of those. I get it. She loves everybody. I'm like, I just need 3. Just give me 3 really good friends. Everybody's wired different, and that's okay. The truth is, though, none of you are wired to do this by yourself. And I promise you, you can't. You need good people beside you and with you, walking through the struggles with you. In Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, you know this passage of Scripture, but it is so, so true. And I want to wrap up this morning with it. 2 people are better off than one, for they can help each other succeed. If one person falls, the other can reach out and help. But someone who falls alone is in real trouble. Good friends are hard to find, aren't they? Reminds me of the story of Mike and John. They're camping up in northern Canada. Mike turns around, he sees a grizzly bear, he yells at John, John, there's a grizzly in the camp. John runs over and he puts his tennis shoes on. Mike's looking at him, he goes, what are you doing? Because you can't outrun the grizzly. John turns around, he goes, I don't have to outrun the grizzly, I just have to outrun you, bro. Some of you will get that joke later too. See, the reality is this. The Christian faith is more than just a vertical relationship between us and God. It's an incredibly important relationship. But the Christian relationship is also believers with other believers, sharing the burden of the struggles that we go through, the sins that we struggle with. I had a lady the last service. Her daughter's 1 year clean of heroin, 14-year heroin addiction. Her mom looks at me and she says, thank you. I didn't do it. It's a group of people that showed up to celebrate recovery, that just own, I don't have it all figured out, but man, I know who does. And that's who we need to chase after. We are in this together. And here's what's crazy cool. There's a lost world that desperately needs Jesus. And we have the answer. But for some reason, we're scared to share in the hope that we have. Hear me, you don't have to be a Bible scholar. I would argue that you shouldn't be. Just be you. Just share what Jesus has done in your life and how he's transformed you, and that you know that he can transform the person that you're engaging with. And just walk with them. Man, there's so many different stories, and there's so many different hurts, and there's so many different trials and tribulations that we all go through. But man, if we could do this together, if we could unite and hold one another up, cheer on one another, celebrate when things are awesome, cry when things are not. I believe more people would love the church.